This event originates on Crowdcast, but can be viewed as well on our Facebook and YouTube pages. For viewers who want to watch with closed captioning, check out YouTube, where you can actually enable real-time captions through the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. And the video will be available for rewatching after tonight's broadcast. The presentation will be introduced momentarily by Seattle University Professor of Criminal Justice, Jackie Helfgott, and Sister Helen's remarks will be followed by a question and answer session. Please submit your questions in the Ask a Question button on Crowdcast. Although we cannot guarantee she'll be able to address every question, we will try to get to as many as possible. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Porochista Kakpour on growing up Iranian in Los Angeles, Bart Gellman on Edward Snowden and the American surveillance state, as well as Michael Shermer, Saru Jayaraman, Bob Ferguson, Tom Mueller, and Tom Carpenter on the current effort to blow the whistle on the Hanford nuclear site, and our annual Engage UW Science series of reports directly from UW Labs, as well as many more. Meanwhile, you'll also find many of our past talks available in our digital media library, so check out the media tab on our homepage, and Town Hall will continue to provide not only ways to stay plugged into the present, but so much more to explore from our recent, if seemingly distant past. Anybody remember February? At any rate, all this work at Town Hall is made possible and inexpensive to the broader community through individual and institutional donors. Town Hall, in particular, the civics programs, I should say, come supported by Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and the Wincote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you know, Town Hall is fundamentally a member-supported organization. And I want to take a moment to thank all the members in our viewing audience tonight. On that point, with the recent event cancellations, Town Hall, along with other nonprofits, has been put under significant financial strain. And if you made a donation on the way into the live stream tonight, thank you. We hope you will all consider supporting us during this time by using the donate button at the bottom of your screen or by becoming a member through our website. Last point, try to remember that our partner booksellers have been hit hard as well. You're attending this program live because you care about the tireless work being done to end the death penalty and Sister Helen's role as one of the movement's spiritual leaders. There are free copies of the book available through Elliott Bay, thanks to a generous gift from Sister Helen herself. But once those are gone, please consider purchasing your copy of the book through the link on this page, and it will be routed right to our dear friends at Elliott Bay, who are basically your bookstore BFFs. All right, then. Here to introduce tonight's speaker, please welcome the director of Seattle University's Crime and Justice Research Center, Professor Jacqueline Helfgott.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be able to introduce Sister Helen Prejean to you tonight. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Seattle University Department of Criminal Justice. We have undergraduate and graduate programs in criminal justice, as well as a crime analysis certificate program. And I am the director of our department's Crime and Justice Research Center, where we conduct research and do service and do continuing education and training on crime and justice issues. We had an all-day continuing education training today featuring the death penalty in conjunction with tonight's event. So I would like to just say a few words about Sister Helen. Sister Helen Prejean is known around the world for her tireless work against the death penalty. She's been instrumental in sparking national dialogue on capital punishment and in shaping the Catholic Church's vigorous opposition to all executions. She joined the Sisters of St. Joseph in 1957, working as a high school teacher and serving as the religious education director at St. Francis Cabrini Parish in New Orleans before moving into the St. Thomas Housing Project in the early 1980s. In 1982, Sister Helen began corresponding with Patrick Saunier, who had been sentenced to death for the murder of 2 teenagers. 2 years later, when Patrick Saunier was put to death in the electric chair, Sister Helen was there to witness his execution. In the following months, she became spiritual advisor to another death row inmate, Robert Lee Willie, who was to meet the same fate as Saunier. After witnessing these executions, Sister Helen realized that this lethal ritual would remain unchallenged unless its secrecy was stripped away, and so she sat down and wrote the book Dead Man Walking, an eyewitness account of the death penalty in the United States. The book ignited a national debate on capital punishment and spawned an Academy Award-winning movie, a play, and an opera. Sister Helen's second book, The Death of Innocents, an eyewitness account of wrongful executions, was published in 2004, and her most recent River of Fire book, which I highly recommend, was published in 2019. And on a personal note, I've had the opportunity to introduce Sister Helen on many occasions. I've started my position as professor in the criminal justice program at department at Seattle University in 1993, which was the same year Dead Man Walking was published. Our students go on to be police officers, corrections officers, federal agents, forensic scientists, forensic psychologists, defense attorneys, prosecuting attorneys, judges, researchers, and crime analysts. And Sister Helen's story in Dead Man Walking has helped me and my colleagues educate a generation of criminal justice students. But more than that, Sister Helen's story has enlightened an entire country and an entire world, reaching people who would generally not be sitting around a dinner table talking about capital punishment. What we do in response to crime is most often driven by the inclination to divide the world into safe and dangerous people, and the anger and fear and shame that comes from that. Sister Helen has done more than any single individual to make people think about how to hold the perspectives of the offender, victim, and community in the same space, or I should say people who have committed crimes, victims, and community in the same space, and to challenge the notion that there is an us and a them. With that, it is my great honor to introduce Sister Helen Prejean.
Thanks, Jacqueline. We've been together all day today. You know, we had this seminar all day with Seattle U, and I am so glad to be part of this town hall and collaborating with Elliott Bay. You know, when you write a book, River of Fire took 7 years to write, and I write books. It's not easy to write a book, but you write it, I do anyway, out of love for the community, because you want to tell a story and you think it could be helpful to other people. So I'm going to direct my first of my remarks tonight with, I'm going to just show how River of Fire is about waking up. I had to wake up on several levels. I had to break out of the religious cocoon. And then the last page of Dead Man Walk, of River of Fire, is the first page of Dead Man Walking. So River of Fire is about waking up to become an active citizen, and Dead Man Walking is what I did when I woke up. So just to say a word about Dead Man Walking, I'd never written a book before. And as Tim Robbins we worked on the film together. It was an incredibly fast thing. The book Dead Man Walking came out in 93. 80% of the American public was for the death penalty. 1994, the paperback came out of Dead Man Walking. Susan Sarandon read the paperback. She was the midwife. She pastored Tim Robbins for 9 months. She knew he was the one to do a film on it. And the film came out by the end of 95. By 1996, it had gotten 4 nominations for the Academy Award. Susan got an Academy Award, and 1.3 billion people in the world were watching. I had never written a book before. I didn't know the power of a book. And I wrote the book because when I came out of that first execution where this man had been strapped down and electrocuted to death, I think in 1984, when the first man, Patrick Saunier, he's the first story in Dead Man Walking, was executed, 90% of people in Louisiana, we're a deep South state. We've been the practitioners of the death penalty for a long time. And I walked out of the execution chamber, and the first thing I did was throw up. I just never witnessed a person being killed in front of my eyes. And because I had such a good editor at Random House, Jason Epstein, you heard of Dead Man Walking. Because when he looked at the first manuscript of the book, he said, Helen, you wait far too long to talk about the actual crime. This man and his brother in cold blood killed 2 teenage kids, and their bodies are found lying in a sugarcane field with bullet holes in the back of their head. And you're so into the human rights of this man who should be executed, you wait far too long in the book before you talk about the horror of this crime and plunging that family for the rest of their lives in grief and trauma. And if you don't talk about the terribleness of what they did in the first 10 pages of this book, nobody's going to read your book. And besides, you're a nun, spiritual advisor, you believe in Jesus, you believe in forgiveness, And they are going to expect every religious platitude out of your mouth. And unless you face the horror of that crime and that you personally are horrified by it, and then your job is going to be to take your reader with you, standing in that horror of the crime, and walk with them on that thin wire to the execution chamber, where then by that, with they're learning about the death penalty and how it works and who gets it and who doesn't, perhaps they can stand with you in recognizing the humanity of a human being and recognize perhaps that the death penalty is not something we want to do as a society. So by the time I walked into the execution chamber with Pat Saunier, and after him 5 others, it was that witness by fire. And it is, in fact, the preface in River of Fire. The fire part of the book, the epigraph is from St. Bonaventure. And fire is passion. Catch on fire with something means it's going to change the rest of your life. And that quote from St. Bonaventure in the epigraph goes like this: ask not for understanding, ask for the fire. And then in the preface, I take you with me being steeped in the fire. And this was the witnessing of the electrocution of Pat Saunier, who was the first in 1984. And that's the way I began River of Fire. They killed a man with fire one night. They strapped him in a wooden chair and pumped electricity through his body until he was dead. His killing was a legal act. He had killed. No religious leaders protested the killing that night. But I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And what I saw set my soul on fire, a fire that burns in me still. And now here's an account of how I came to be in the killing chamber that night and the spiritual currents that brought me there. And that begins River of Fire. So you never would have seen this book if I hadn't had a wonderful editor, Robert Ellsberg, that helped me through. I'm going through my whole blooming life, okay? And I mean, it could have been called The Swamp, and you never would have heard of the book because there were so many detours. There were so many circuitous routes, so many stories I wanted to tell. And boy, you know, it's a team effort to write a book. You need an editor. I need an editor. And boy, Robert cut out brushwork. He cut out 100 pages to have a good, clean story so you got the journey. So starting out as a child in Louisiana, good mama and daddy, good Catholic mom and daddy, a sister Mary Ann. We were just 11 and a half months apart. I did everything with her. I learned from her. She just died in 2016. It was a huge loss. In a way, you know, when mama died and daddy died, well, it was time. They were being diminished and they were ready to move on. But my sister, who was always braver than me, like we'd be over with friends and everybody's lining up on the limb of a tree and they're going to throw the swing up to you and you got to jump to catch it. Everybody's done it but me, and I'm the last one on the limb. And there's Mary Ann. Helen, don't be a sissy. Look, grab the rope. Well, you see, the thing was that you couldn't have the rope come and then the swing was under you while you're standing on a branch, but you had to leap to catch the rope. And I was such a sissy. It was such a coward. And there she is at the bottom, her hands on her hips. Helen, don't be a sissy. Come on. We all did it. And, you know, after she died, I put this in the afterword of the book. You may want to start there first, actually. It tells a lot of the stories of what happened afterwards and all. And I still hear her saying that to me. Helen, look, we all die. I died, you're going to die. Don't be a sissy. Other people have done it before. You're going to have what you need. You're going to be able to do it. So I have her inside me. So Mary Ann, my little brother Louis, I still call him my little brother. What is he, 76? And we're all up there. And so where did I grow up as a child? Baton Rouge, Louisiana. in the 40s and 50s, Jim Crow was still in effect. I never questioned it. People in Sacred Heart Church, white people sat in one section. All the black people had to sit way over to the right over in Sacred Heart Church. Black kids couldn't receive their first Holy Communion with the white kids. And communion in the Catholic Church is supposed to be the unity we all have in Christ, except black kids can't receive it with white kids. So the thing about growing up is you grow up in a culture. This good mom and daddy. Daddy was a lawyer. He had a lot of black clients. I found in his book, we all did after he died, $5 that somebody owed him. And we had this couple, a black couple that worked for us and actually lived in this little house behind our big house called the servants' quarters, Ellen and Jesse. Jesse worked in the yard, Ellen in the house with Mama. I never even knew their last names. Mom and Daddy were kind. Daddy helped Ellen and Jesse buy property, helped Jesse get a good job at the refinery, but never questioned the Jim Crow laws and what it meant to be a black person and not be able to allowed to drink at the same water fountain or go into a theater. In the theaters in Baton Rouge during the Jim Crow era, the balcony part was where the black people sat, the crow's nest, as the white people would call it. Never questioned it. And here I am, a Catholic, I'm a Christian, but culture is the thing that determines so much of what we see and how we interpret things. And I lived in a deep Southern culture. So I'll start off with the story of childhood, a very pious child. You know, we went to Mass often. We said the rosary every night. Mom and Daddy were really good Catholics. We all were. I mean, the rosary, I don't know if you know much about Catholic devotions, but the rosary is like a really big devotion, you know. And we'd say it every night in the family. And that's 150 blooming Hail Marys, you say, but sprinkled in with Our Fathers and Glory Bees in between. And you meditate on all the mysteries of the life of Christ, you know. So here we are on these family trips, 3 kids in the back seat, Mom and Daddy in the front. And Daddy really believed in traveling as education. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had been all over the United States, Canada, and even Europe. But here you are in a family station wagon, like for a month or 5-6 weeks. And so kids, inevitably, somebody poking somebody, thinking of poking somebody. Mama, she's poking me. And somebody would say, shut up, man, we're going to have to do another rosary. Too late. There goes Mama. In the name of the Father. I mean, 150 Hail Marys later. It's like Catholic riddling. There were some settled down kids in the back seat. So I'll tell these stories about us as a family, about growing up. And then in high school, went to St. Joseph Academy. And that's when I decided to be a nun. We had the best teachers at St. Joseph Academy. They challenged us to think intellectually. And they were on the leading edge of the faith and how to think about faith and how to practice your faith and not just blindly just accept things. They were questioners and they taught us to do that. And they were happy. I know they got a lot of mean nun stories out there. You know, in fact, the first man on death row, Pat Sonia, he and his brother talked about these mean nuns that had this ruler would slap them on the knuckles if they didn't, you know, get the answers right. God's love. What, you got it wrong? Bang, bang, bang on the knuckles. God's love. Remember that. That's the right answer. I mean, crazy stories. But our nuns were fun and they were kind and they were intellectually challenging. And I thought to myself, that's what I want to be. Now, you got to realize this is in the 50s. For Catholic girls, you had 2 choices. You could be a nun or you got married. There was no place for you if you were single. That was neither fish nor flesh. I mean, you weren't holy enough to be a nun. You couldn't find anybody to be married. I heard my classmates talking about, you know, going to LSU for husbandry. And man, everybody got married out of my class, almost everybody. And some of us became nuns. It also appealed to me that it would be a way of life in which I would not be settled with one human being for my happiness. And well, the way I put it was I could go kind of wide with my love. Well, I'm going to tell you in the stories of how being a nun, trying to be holy, had its challenges after you got past that first romantic thing of the sound of music, and now you're settled in and you have solitude, you have quiet, and you have prayer, and you have that nobody was supposed to be close to anybody else. They had a thing about shunning particular relationships in the novitiate. I mean, in the novitiate, you wouldn't even sit in recreation next to the same nun twice. Are you going to have Mother Noemi, the novice mistress, saying you had a particular relationship? So it was out without any kind of intimacy, friendship. And boy, after 2.5 years of novitiate, then we made our first temporary vows. I knew I wasn't going to be able to make it without being able to have friendship. And I've come to appreciate that friendship maybe is one of the best gifts of life that we ever have. And so I talk about the developing of a friendship with Sister Christopher. She was 2 years ahead of me, and talked about how we got to be friends and how we stayed friends and how we developed our friendship. And you got to realize that in those days, we didn't have any freedom. This was before Vatican II happened in the Catholic Church. Vatican II happened between 1962 and 1965. And that was the first time there had ever been one of these worldwide councils in the Catholic Church led by Pope John the 23rd, whose focus was not to condemn some heretics, some Protestants getting it wrong, but it was about opening the doors and windows of the Catholic Church out to the world, to be able to respond to the world, its sufferings, its joys, to be a part of things, and to take the challenge of the gospel of Jesus away from just the pious application of just praying for people, but getting involved in the issues of the day, being in solidarity with people. And believe me, nobody took Vatican II and its mandates. For the first time, it affirmed that each of us had conscience, which was the primary, the sacred place of the encounter of God with each individual. And for the first time, pointed to involvement with the world and not shunning the world as a place where evil was and sin. And in the early days of religious life, it's like we were semi-cloistered. I mean, the teachers that taught with us at St. Joseph Academy could never come in the part of the convent where the nuns were. It was like cloistered. There was this thing of being away from the world. And we were all dressed in this habit. It was from 1650, which was the widow's garb. It's how the widows dressed in France. And it was the way religious dressed, because it was the only way they can have freedom to go out on the streets to be with the people. The only people who could go out unaccompanied by a man, clearly widows. Obviously, it's clear why the man wasn't there. But that's the garb we adopted as nuns so that we could, and it was a new way of being religious. Before then, before St. Vincent de Paul began the Daughters of Charity in 1610 and described that the streets are their cloister, the parish church is their chapel, that before then nuns were cloistered. But what was begun that St. Vincent de Paul did in Sisters of St. Joseph, which I am, came next, was a way of being a dedicated person of the gospel with prayer, the contemplative part of your life, but spilled over into apostolic service of the neighbor. So you don't just stay in the cloister, you go out on the streets. And so we continue that. We're called an apostolic congregation. So when Vatican II came along with its reforms, nobody welcomed it more than us nuns, because the way our life was before, in fact, it was this way a lot for Catholics, period. Just blind obedience to superiors. You're just a layman or you're just a lowly novice. The way you obey the will of God is you obey your superiors. They will tell you the will of God. And at the beginning of River, I'll give you a sociological picture, like of what our life was like as nuns before Vatican II. You were never going to make another decision in your life. You knew what you were going to dress in every day of your life. You knew that your work would be determined by the superiors for you, whether you teach or nurse. That was in someone else's hands. So there was almost no agency, self-direction in your life. So when Vatican II comes along and says that we needed to develop selfhood, that holiness means wholeness of life. And it's not just this doing penance and avoiding sin. It's developing your mind, developing your heart, developing your talents. And so our Sisters of St. Joseph in New Orleans, where I was, boy, those Vatican documents were coming out. We were getting them printed. We were studying them. And within 4 years, we changed the way we govern the community. The obedience was going to be a much deeper and harder obedience, to try to listen to the Spirit of God moving in us about the needs of the world. And it's right what led me eventually to death row. If Vatican II hadn't happened, I probably would have remained a nun within the confines and the mindset, although maybe not, because there's a part of us that wants to be self-directed. There's a part of us that wants to make our own decisions. There's a part of us that wants to read and be intellectually challenged. The part of us that's curious, wants to know things. So we blossomed after Vatican II. And I blossomed with my community. And I dedicate River Fire to my religious community, the Sisters of St. Joseph, because they were the ones who helped me grow up all through my young years. I had a reputation in the community. They would say, there goes Helen with one of her harebrained ideas about converting the world to Christ. There she goes, her feet firmly planted in midair. And I tell you those stories because it was just so me. I was just idealistic. I thought, hey, somebody gave us a piece of land. Let's have a boot camp for Jesus, and let's have young people there. And so we had the community meeting. And so the questions are coming. Well, Helen, what are you going to live in? You got the land, but do you have running water? Is there electricity? Do you have buildings? I had nothing. And so it went down in flames, but then they helped me. And in the discernment then, I moved into the St. Thomas housing projects, and for the first time in my life, began to live among African-American people whom I had only known as servants when I was growing up. And they became my teachers about the other America, about how the police treated you if you were Black. How many young men, we had a community meeting one time at Hope House for the people in the neighborhood. Every young Black man had a bad experience with the police. Every one of them. I just didn't know what was going on. I wasn't scared of any policeman. If my car had broken down at 2:00 in the morning on a highway and a state trooper had pulled up, I'd go, thank God, man, I got help. I didn't know about white privilege. I didn't know simply by being white, I was trusted more, that nobody would ask me about my credit card or I'd ever be told, oh, you're a real credit to your race. I didn't know anything. And I've learned that too about the death penalty, that it's not that Americans are so vengeful and can't wait to have the death penalty. They've never had an opportunity to think deeply about it or even to see how the thing works or doesn't work and all the mistakes. So it's such a beautiful, glorious thing to wake up. River Fire is all about waking up. And so in the St. Thomas housing projects, I was waking up to all kinds of things. Then I was ready to read Martin Luther King's life. Then I was ready to read about that great Catholic saint, Dorothy Day, who opened up the Catholic worker houses for homeless people and began to feed people food, doing the real down-home stuff. And I'd always read the gospel stories. I was hungry. You gave me to eat. I was in prison and you came to me. But I don't know. I just had a way of kind of spinning those stories to spiritualize them, like, well, there's a lot of ways, to be in prison, like if you're shy and you go in a whole room full of people, well, it's kind of like you're in prison. But to go into a prison, I had to wake up to that. And that's what River's about. It's about the waking up. So in St. Thomas, it was just such a grace to have people, and they were so patient. One more little white lady waking up about the legacy of slavery and racism in the United States. We had this great group of people called Undoing Racism. I learned about institutional racism. The difference between prejudice and racism is prejudice is the individual people. I don't like you, I'm prejudiced against you. Racism is prejudice institutionalized. For example, linguistically, in language. And you can look in the dictionary. Look for the definition of white, pure, unsullied, black, sinister, bad, blackball, blacklist. It's in the language. I'm going to really learn how it's in the criminal justice system and how it worked in the death penalty. And then as I learned about the penal system, how 90% of people in Angola are white, are black, 75% are black. And overwhelmingly, the death penalty is sought only when white people are killed, because white people's lives are more highly valued than black people's lives. I was just going to learn so many things. And that was the beginning of awakening then, to be with people, to see the struggle with the measly amount of welfare. And this is right as Reagan was elected president. And he's talking about the welfare Cadillac woman, which gave that image of people are abusing welfare. If they would just get a job and send their kids to school, they really could be. They could live the great American dream, like blaming people. I had no idea the difference it makes when you go to get a job, if you're a black person. In fact, Carlos Crockett, who's this great kid, he graduated from high school. He even went on to do a few years of college. And when he was in high school in the summer, he's looking for a summer job. And so there was a drugstore, and it was just hauling boxes and putting stuff on the shelf. That was the job. But they looked at his address, where he lived. He lived in the St. Thomas housing projects. And they wouldn't give him the job just because of his address. I learned about redlining of banks, that you wouldn't give loans. I had everything to learn. I remember their patience with me. And of course, it's while I'm in St. Thomas, and that's one of the last chapters of River of Fire, when I had awakened, and I'm now in the African-American community. And so everything's going to change once you're in that kind of soil, the kind of books you read. And my teachers were Amnesty International. I began to learn about human rights. I learned that human rights are inalienable to the human person. Inalienable, it means simply because you're a person, you have these rights. And these rights can't be alienated from you, taken away from you. And so governments don't give human rights to people for good behavior. And you can't trust governments to take human rights away from people for bad behavior, which led to the whole thing of, and quoting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, which Eleanor Roosevelt helped forge after the atrocities of World War II and the Holocaust and all, universal human rights. Article 3, everyone has a right to life. And it was a big old debate. Oh, except where the state has determined that some people could be executed. Big old debate about it. And Eleanor Roosevelt held out and said, these are universal human rights, and we don't want to start watering them down with making exceptions right from the beginning. Article 5, no human being should be subjected to cruel and degrading punishment or torture. As of yet, our Supreme Court will not acknowledge, cannot see that when they read in the Eighth Amendment about cruel and unusual punishment, they don't recognize that the sentencing of a conscious, imaginative being and then housing them in a small cell for 20 or more years and then marching them down a hall and killing them is the practice of cruelty. How do people come to such different interpretations? The Constitution, I found out, is not really unlike the Bible, the way people quote the Bible. It's really easy to go to a Bible for a quote ready passage you want to spin out there to back up. And I'll give you a recent example. It's within the last 10 months. Former Attorney General Jeff Sessions went to the Epistle of Paul to the Romans, chapter 13. And this was to justify that you could separate children from their parents at the border. And what is that quote from St. Paul? It is, obey civil authority because for you they are the voice of God. Well, he takes that quote from St. Paul and says, these parents coming to the border unlawfully, they're breaking our law. Therefore, they're breaking the law of God, and we are justified then. They are the cause of their children being separated from them because they're breaking the law and identifying the law with the will of God. Which isn't that what a theocracy does? That's not what determines law, is it? And Justice Scalia would do the same thing about the death penalty, use that same quote. And that's without any kind of context. There's very little understanding of the Bible and the time in which it was written and the context. We have such biblical, I'm not kidding you now with this next thing I'm going to tell you. We have such biblical illiteracy in this country that 13% of the American public identified Joan of Arc as Noah's wife. Now, Noah was the guy on the ark during the flood. So you have this quoting of the Bible. So you have this way of interpreting the Constitution. It's real life experiences with real people that is what impassions our hearts and helps us grow into being active and concerned citizens. And River is just my story of waking up. And I had to break out of two cocoons. One was the religious cocoon, where for a long, long time I thought, as a good, pious nun, that if I prayed to God for the big problems of the world, that's the way they would be settled. And I had to wake up to, and the way Jesus talked actually about the kingdom of God being among us, that it was going to take partnership with God in us to roll up our sleeves, to help create the change that needed to happen in the world. So spiritually, I had to break out of that cocoon of a two-tiered system. The most important thing, well, you know, some people are poor, I know, but one day they're going to have a great reward in heaven, as if it's God's will for them to be poor. We built the systems, the economic systems and cultural systems that keep 40 million people in our own country, the richest country in the world, poor. So part of what Vatican II did is it woke us up intellectually. We start getting in there and start reading sociology, start reading the news, start studying the political system. What's going on here? So the first cocoon was out of just don't think if you just pray, that's all you got to do. And the second one was a cultural one. I had grown up in upper middle class and white. And it was a cultural thing I had to break out of. And of course, the whole first part of my religious life, teaching, which I loved. I talk about my teaching years at St. Francis Cabrini, 7th and 8th grade, boys and girls, English and religion, loving it. Just always loved teaching, still love teaching. I guess my classroom just got a little bigger, although now it's me learning along with you. It's more encounters, mutual encounter together and learning together than me teaching kids, you know. But so I had those two big divides. But the coming to St. Thomas was just huge. And I'd take you with me. One of the good things about not knowing stuff, one of the gifts I think of Dead Man Walking, you know, while Tim was doing the movie, he kept saying, well, you know, the nun is in over our head. And the nun wasn't over our head. And one of the gifts of that is on page 1 of Dead Man Walking, you know, you don't have an expert stepping out there on the page saying, now look, I know all about this. Let me take you through this. I'm going to teach you. He goes, that nun doesn't know what she's doing. And you can learn with somebody who's learning. And especially I wrote Dead Man Walking in the present tense, so you can come with me, and River of Fire in the present tense. So you come with me as I learn and as I grow, and we can do it together. I did not know the power of a book. I learned through Dead Man Walking the power of a book. You got to know I'm Cajun. I come from Louisiana. We believe in talking to each other, okay? So to write a book, for me at first, just seemed like such a passive thing. You know, it's just words sitting in a page and sitting in a bookstore, sitting in the Elliott Bay bookstore right now, just doesn't even have a little finger to come out the book and say, hey, Ray, it was just passive. And boom, Dead Man Walking hit. And I learned the power of a book. And I learned the power in telling story, and this is true in River too, that when we take people with us into our interiority, in our inner life, when we're making mistakes, when we're learning, they can come with us because we're using our imaginations when we read. I don't know if you've ever heard of Lynn Hunt. She wrote a book called Inventing Human Rights, and this is telling the stories in the epistolary novels of women that were written in the 18th century. Richardson did Pamela, another book. Rousseau did Julie. Epistolary novels, meaning it was the letters that the women, now they're novels, it's fiction, but the letters women would write to their sisters or friends, talking about what they were experiencing and enduring. Here I am, 13 years old, and I'm being married off to this old man, and he's very mean and cruel to me. The effect that those novels had, that men were reading about women and could make a compassionate connection with the suffering of women. When Rousseau wrote the book Julie, Julie dies in the book, and some man in the military wrote to Rousseau and just said, I wept buckets when Julie died. And what books can do is they give us an imaginative framework to cross over into other people's experiences that we wouldn't otherwise meet. And of course, that's what Dead Man Walking does with the person on death row. It's what the book does with me, with the victims, with all the things that happen in it. And Lynn Hunt is the first to say there's not a cause effect. Epistolary novels of women in the 18th century then led straight to the Declaration of Human Rights. But it definitely tilled the soil of compassion in society so that when you build human rights or understand them, it's that everyone simply by being a human being has human rights, which can't be taken from them. And if we don't have compassion, look at us in our society today, immigrants. If you made to be afraid of these immigrants, that they can come in and take our jobs or worse, whatever, when we made to be afraid, social distancing is something we have been doing a long, long time. When you look at another human being and just say, you are not like me. I will never murder anybody. Look at you. You did that. You deserve this punishment. Or immigrants. Or just look at any of the social issues that we have, the penal system. And you know what's interesting? With COVID-19 now in its fertile breeding ground in prisons and jails, and with 420,000 guards and staff that work in the prisons going in and out of jails and prisons every day and going back to their family, We cannot say any longer, oh, lock them up and throw away the key. We can wall off the virus from the rest of us. We don't care what happens to them. They deserve what they get. They deserve to be punished. That distancing. We can't say that anymore with this COVID-19 because we're all in it. We're interconnected with each other, even with the guards being these vectors coming back and forth. It plunges us together to look at the good of everybody. So let me tell you a little bit about the whole journey of religion and my own Catholic church and the death penalty. And you got to know, I talk about this journey of waking up. The last page, as I mentioned, of River of Fire is the first page of Dead Man Walking. And when I got involved with human rights, the churches, I mean, I'm going to tell you, there was a terrible statistic in the mid-'80s. Pat was executed in 84. I started getting involved. And the Catholic Church and other Christian churches, the statistics showed that the more people went to church, the more they believed in the death penalty. Going, what? What is faith? When you read the gospel of Jesus and its challenge to us to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute, where are you finding in the gospel of Jesus that because someone's killed, we can entrust our government to determine the worst of those murderers and set up a system to kill them? Why are you quoting Jesus to back that up? And one of the things I found out, and you start digging into theology and everything, once you become awakened, that got to be involved in this issue, is the way the crucifixion of Jesus has been interpreted. And there's an atonement thing of Jesus sacrificed. He gave his life over to the Heavenly Father in payment for our sins. And that's what saved us. And if you think that's dead in people, or nobody believes that anymore, last year in Wyoming, the vote was down to one vote to repeal the death penalty in Wyoming. And here's this lady who said, no, I'm not voting for repeal. If Jesus hadn't been crucified and executed for our sin, we wouldn't have been saved from our sins. It's time we really got to get Jesus right. We got to get religion right. I hate to see what's being done with the gospel of Jesus for a prosperity gospel. The more money you make, that means you're close to God. Or using like Romans 13 to say, oh, if you obey the law in the United States, you're really obeying the will of God. Poor Jesus. I mean, there's a great line in Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield. And he said, if Jesus could see what's being done in his name today, I mean, I think Jesus would puke. Well, I got to get Jesus right in my own life. And so that's the story of my own unfolding. But just briefly, the dialogue with the Catholic Church, seeing that preface when I talk about witnessing that execution, and I say no religious leaders protested the execution, I meant partly my Catholic Church as well. And that's not because people had bad will. There was a long tradition, and not just Catholics, Protestants too, that would give the state the right to take life to protect society when you had violent people in society and no prisons, and you had to have a way to keep people safe. It was always about defense of society. And you grow, you evolve. And the way any society evolves is people within the society start growing. And consciousness changes. And then gradually you change the law. Gradually you change the doctrine in the Catholic Catechism that would no longer countenance that there would be instances where you could turn over to the state the right to take the life of another human being. That took 1,600 blooming years of dialogue. And on August 2nd, 2018, Pope Francis finally changed the Catholic Catechism. The books are the last thing you change. You look at the death penalty around the United States, the practice changes before you change it on the books. The legislators are the last ones to do things. The Supreme Court follows the people. Finally, when enough states will have abolished the death penalty, the Supreme Court will be able to find, oh yeah, it's against your constitutional rights, but not before. Often our people in the courts, I find, are not the leaders. They follow the people to interpret Eighth Amendment. You shall not practice cruel punishment. What does cruel mean? So I would have been part of the dialogue with the Catholic Church. And in River of Fire, there's another dialogue that needs to go on in the Catholic Church. And so it's in an appendix of my letter to Pope Francis. And it's about women in the Catholic Church. So I got to know Pope Francis. I got to tell you a little bit about the story. Innocent man in Oklahoma, Richard Glossop. I don't know how I get involved. These people call me. They parachute in on my life. Here's this voice on the phone, Richard Glossop, 2015, January. Sister Helen, I'm really sorry. I apologize. I know I didn't ask your permission or anything, but I just put you down to be with me if I'm executed because I feel you could help me. Excuse me, sister. I know I didn't ask your permission. And oh my goodness, will you be with me if I'm executed? Well, I begin to read up. Doesn't take much. By now, I'm not totally surprised that someone could be innocent on death row. Of the 7 people that I've been with on death row, 3 have been innocent. I'm with Manuel Ortiz in Louisiana now. He's going on 29 years on death row, and he's innocent. But it's how to show that in the courts, how you get it in the courts. So here's this man. So I get involved with Richard Glossop. And in the course of trying to save his life, what you do is you get on your social media, you get out there, you reach out to people. And I reached out to Pope Francis. And I knew he'd respond. I'd already been reading about him. The first thing he did as Pope was to go to a prison and wash the feet of the prisoners, the Muslims, everybody. I went, that's a guy that has a heart for the gospel of Jesus, who's going to get it about the death penalty in a heartbeat. And indeed he did. And he did what he could for Richard. Well, I got to meet him later, the next year, 2016. My main reason was to deliver to him a letter from Richard Glossop to thank him for intervening in his life, playing a part in helping to save his life. And if you read anything about that story, if you go into our social media, we have the Richard Glossop story there. It's all on sisterhelen.org. We got Facebook, we got Instagram, we got Twitter. We got everything going on with social media because it's really important to get the discourse out there with people and to stay in the public discourse. Stay there. You got to keep learning about this stuff. And so that was Pope Francis. So I met him. So we had this. He did his best for Richard Glossop. And so I have this chance. I'll write this book, River of Fire. And in the appendix is my letter to him. The sexism in the church is just so clear simply because you're a woman. And I said to the Pope, I said, Pope Francis, I have preached in every church and synagogue. I've spoken before the United Nations. I've spoken all over the world, but I am not allowed to preach in my own church. Only a man can preach. Only a male can read the gospel. And when you say that when we baptized, all of us are made in the image and likeness of God, what is it different about a female being baptized that I can't be a religious leader or speak or preach like a man simply because I'm a woman? Now, if you want a definition of sexism, there it is. And I just said, I know you can't change everything in this church, but we got to get this dialogue going with the people. And eventually, I just want to say that is what is going to prevail, because you cannot have that you have a church teaching that simply because you're a woman, that you are automatically prohibited from decision-making in the top bodies of the church, or even becoming a leader in prayer, which is what a priest is. So there it is. So there's that dialogue. We change through dialogue. We learn through dialogue. And that's how we change slavery. I mean, just think of it. Look how long we had slavery. It had such a strong economic hold on us in the South, and in fact, in the whole country. Finding out that, you know, Thomas Jefferson had slaves. I mean, it was deeply ingrained in the country. How did it change? Well, a number of factors happen. And my concrete picture of it is one of the biggest auction places was for slavery in New Orleans. You know, New Orleans is a really big port city, and you had slaves being brought in all the time. And there was an auction, the auction block in what is now Jackson Square, or in the French Quarter. And there's St. Louis Basilica. So this is the kind of thing, imaginatively, I picture. So here's a woman, she's just gone to Mass. She has 3 children. She has one of her little ones with her. And they're coming out of the Basilica, and they're walking in Jackson Square. There's the auction, and slaves are being auctioned. And she watches. And there's a woman with 3 children, and the children are auctioned off and are taken from her, and she's trying to hold on to her children. They're being grabbed from her. They're being taken. And then she's bought, and she sees that. And she's a mother. Kind of like the men reading the epistolary novels of the 18th century. But this is direct. There's the saying in Latin America, what the eye does not see, the heart cannot feel. There she is, getting ready to go home after Mass. And then she sees this woman being taken away from her children. And the humanity in her speaks. And story after story after story like that, witnessing of that is one of the things that finally did abolish slavery. We grow as a people. The women getting the vote. If you could read some of the arguments of why women should not be allowed to vote when that was going on hot and heavy in this country. Read some of the religious arguments, they're terrible. But just why women can't think like a man. They can't think to be rational enough, especially certain times of the month. We can't trust women in these hysterical states to vote. I mean, but we know better now, and we laugh at that. But women still don't have equal pay to men for doing the same job. It's still in there. And with the church, it's in there too. I don't know, there's a thing about truth, and there's a thing about us sharing with each other, which brings us to this town hall meeting. There's nothing better than a group of human beings coming together. You can say we're coming together electronically, online, or whatever, but we are together in this conversation. And then we hook up with a book. And when we read a book, we're not debating anybody. We're in a meditative frame. And it can bring us deeply into something. And it might even spark something in us that could change our lives. I'm really happy to be doing this with Elliott Bay Bookstore. You want to hear something really ironical? When Dead Man Walking came out in 93, I had 2 book tours, one with Random House, mostly in the Northeast, big cities. And then a friend of mine, Magdalena Rosavilla, with Amnesty International, we rented a van and packed it in the back with Dead Man Walking. The book had just come out. And we started in San Diego and made our way across California, 2 weeks on the road, and ended up in Seattle at the Elliott Bay Bookstore. It was the first time I had seen the bookstore, beautiful wood. I mean, now I know we can't be there in person, but this very same bookstore where Dead Man Walking made its entrance into the world for the first time was, and now here we are collaborating with Elliott Bay again for this book, River of Fire, to get it out. It's an invitation to citizenship and to activism. It's the invitation to get off the sidelines which can make you very depressed. The more news you look at, the more you hear, you go, oh, I'm one person. What am I going to do? The more paralyzed you get when you're standing on the side. But what I've noticed about taking action is the minute you put your hands on a rope of action and begin to pull, whether it's for children at the border, whether it's right now for food for people. We have people hungry now. We have a mile-long parade of cars in Dallas, Texas, people lining up for food because of what the pandemic is doing. There are all kinds of things waiting for us. And I found that it was for the simplest thing, but when we act, boy, I mean, life flows through us. Action's very freeing. Life flows through us and we become alive in a way. It may be the simplest action in the world, but it is freeing to be a person of action. So I offer you River of Fire. And then the invitation. I mean, Elliot Bay's got both the books, River of Fire about waking up, and I've been walking what I did when I woke up, and invite you to wake up and get involved. I think I'm done for this part. And now we welcome questions.
Okay, thank you, Sister Helen. So we've got 4 or so questions, and I'll start. And if anyone else has questions, feel free to post them, and we will get to what we can. So the first question from JM, Sister Helen, you speak of the blinding that can occur through culture in regards to the Jim Crow South. Do you think that the same cultural blindness has occurred in the Catholic Church as it pertains to the role of women and celibacy for priests?
Yes. Well, I just spoke about for women, surely. The patriarchy. See, patriarchy. The Bible was written out of patriarchy. Often women's names are not even given in the Bible stories. The church deeply in patriarchy with men. Look, still men are the decision makers. That's clearly sexism. Celibacy didn't come into the church for a long time. The apostles we know were married. Deacons were married. And celibacy, and there are a number of reasons maybe that celibacy came into the church. There are gifts of being celibate. The difference between priestly celibacy is it comes with the package. If you're going to be a priest, you got to be celibate. I choose to be celibate. It's one of the vows I take. The difference between religious communities and diocesan priests is their celibacy is you want to be a priest, you got to be celibate. Although we see in the Protestant church, we even see in the Greek Orthodox church or the Melkite rite where priests are married. There's no big deal about what is it that you can't live the gospel if you're married. I mean, once you start really thinking about it. So it's being questioned, and it's being questioned more and more. What's the foundation of it? And I believe it too will change. It's going to take time. But once you get that discussion started, and you begin to look into the roots of things and how it came to be in the first time and whether or not it continues to be justified. That's how things change. I believe it will change.
Okay, the next question from Barker. It has been more than 4 years since your letter to Pope Francis. Have you received any response from leadership in the Catholic Church, or have you perceived the Church to be receptive to your comments or change in any fashion in those 4 years?
The change I see is the call to look into the fact of the whole thing of women being deacons in the church. So if you know anything about church structure, deacons came early in the church, and diaconate, or being a deacon, is actually the first step in ordination. It's been resisted for that reason. I happened to be in England shortly after the Anglicans voted that women could also be priests, and some of the clergy were openly weeping after that meeting, and they said, where we went down the tube on this issue was we allowed them to be deacons, because then they used that argument. Diaconate is a step to ordination, so they already were ordained, and that's what has led to this mess as they saw it in the end of the Anglican Church. So I've noticed that under the Pope's leadership, there's a call for the whole thing of deacons, and that women ought to be able to be allowed to preach. So you don't turn a cruise ship around automatically, but you get women preaching in church, and people hear that women's spiritual leadership can be that of a man, that there's nothing about being a woman that says that you can't talk about what the gospel's about. That's the only concrete direction of change. I'll say, I didn't expect the Pope to write me back and say, good idea. I think we'll have women leadership in the country. He can't do that on his own. It has to be this development of consciousness within the whole church. Another gift of Vatican II in the church was, it's the people who are the church. It's the people who are the church, not the clergy primarily or the hierarchy. It's the people. And it's the people who change things.
Okay, so let's see. We have another question from Cindy. Your awakening brought you to understand that your task was to engage actively with people suffering in the world. How does this awakening relate to the unity of all religions and the unity of all mankind?
Beautiful. Because you look at the deep roots of any spiritual tradition, be it Buddhism, you look in Judaism, it's always at the heart of it is about compassion, that we are brothers and sisters. In the Christian faith, to love God is to love your neighbor. St. John, in the first epistle of John, nobody's ever seen God. But if you love your brother and you love your sister, all spiritual traditions have that. The Buddhists have developed compassion to such an extent that all living creatures, so they're vegetarians, they refuse to eat meat, to eat animals. Look how deep their compassion goes, and for the earth as well. And so it applies. Thank you for that question, because it's just right at the heart of what spiritual life and religion is supposed to be. Not a dividing thing, not a thing of our religion's better than yours, or we got the truth and you're heretics, all that crazy stuff about dividing and from one another and condemning one another, competing with one another. That's never, as I understand, what God is about. Jesus saying, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. When you translate perfect, it really means be compassionate as your heavenly Father, as your heavenly Mother, which now in prayers, when you go to say the Our Father, we say, Our Father, our Mother. Mary, the Virgin Mary's really been the embodiment of the mercy of God. And I tell the story of being so scared of God, being so scared of judgment and sin, and the sheep and the goats at the last judgment, man, I'm going to be thrown with the goats, and so scared. Religion used fear. Well, Vatican II began to undo that in the Catholic Church. Not to be afraid. You do what you do, not because you're scared that there's going to be some wrathful God going to send you to hell. You want to believe an unbelievable story, just to show how much this fear thing is with us. One time, I was on a popular TV show in New Orleans, the Angela Hill Show, and I was on opposite the DA at the time, Harry Connick Sr. Good Catholic man, right? Prosecutor, went for the death penalty every chance he got. And he said this, and I was so stunned when he said it. I couldn't even get a response. It was the end of the show. It was over. He said, look, the death penalty, that's just a temporary penalty. You don't be afraid of the death penalty. People can save their souls by being executed for their crime, and they go to heaven, they save their souls. Be afraid of God, who has an eternal punishment. You die in mortal sin and you go to hell, that's eternal punishment. At least the death penalty is only temporary punishment. I mean, you only got a few minutes on this TV show. What are you going to say? I was so stunned that he could say that. But look at that. Look at that belief. Basically, that God is this rewarder or punisher. And the deepest spiritual traditions teach us it's not about reward and punishment. It's about that compassion and love and getting out of ego to love one another and to love one another selflessly and to grow in that love and in a wider and wider way so that we're not afraid about people or of people who are different from us. That's what it's really all about.
Okay, let's see. We've got a few more questions coming in. Sister Helen, I think you've touched on this, but Sister Helen, what do you envision for the future of women's religious congregations?
Interesting thing happening. You can see we're all aging, and the way of life as we lived it is changing. And so we do have some vocations. When I became a nun at 18, I'd take you through that. A young child, bride of Christ. I was so young, I hadn't even developed a self yet. Now women, generally, I think the median age would be in their 40s that choose religious life. They may have been married, their husband died, or they're looking for a life in which they can be of service, but also have a spiritual life, devote time to the spiritual life. But they're nowhere near the numbers that we had, like in the 40s and 50s. I mean, there were hundreds in the missions, and that's fading. What's coming in its place? I just had this very alive meeting just 3 days ago, are associates with religious communities. And so they're people that develop their spiritual life and are associated with us in our ministries. But they're not taking a lifelong vow of celibacy, which is really a formidable thing to take on, especially if you're young, but can share in our spiritual life with us and then also be associated with us in ministry. That's what's developing, and I think that's going to be the future of religious life.
Okay, next question. I very much appreciate your optimism, faith that things will change for the better. For example, abolition of the death penalty, change in the role of women in the church, etc. But wonder what advice you have for maintaining that hope in times like now when things seem to be moving in the opposite direction.
To stay in touch, close touch with a community of people that share your ideals and your faith, and work. That, it's never going to be the whole ball game changing. Look at America. I'm looking at my country. There are so many things in my country that I disagree with, but I'm not leaving my country. But I'll work with people of like mind to work for change. If we're alone and we're not in community and working for change, then we don't have hope. Hope means we're active in some kind of way. And it also means that we're not a lone ranger trying to do something by ourselves, but we're connected in community. So one of the first groups that I joined, the ACLU that works for justice, Amnesty International works for human rights, and then local communities that was working for racial justice in New Orleans. It's community. And it's that faith to work. It's combined with work, really doing stuff and not just sighing and lamenting the problems of the world. It also means real intellectual rigor of really looking at the problems and digging in to get the root of it so that we have real understanding. We really have to use our intellectual ability to understand things, to see patterns, to see change, and to critique it.
Okay, so the next question from Michael: how do we stand for equity in our days of the pandemic for the most affected Black, Native American, and Hispanic people? As a nurse, I see no national response to these needs, and I know how deeply the church's presence influences these populations of people. How can we wake up public policy and church response to this suffering?
Oh, yeah.
From Kathleen, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Kathleen. Of course. Look, it ought to be, well, here's a big discovery I made, that it's not often, in fact, our first movement in Louisiana to end the death penalty were not many church people at all that were involved in it. There were college students, a lot of people didn't go to church. I mean, when people speak the truth and they work for justice, it's first question is not what religious congregation do you belong to, but those of us who are people of faith and belong to a tradition, who are our people? Who are the people around us? Who are the local community that we are with? that we do spiritual sharing with, and we get involved in action together. That's what's really important. And sometimes it's going to be people in our faith community, and sometimes it's going to be people who believe in human rights for whatever reason. I mean, we have a pandemic. When you look at the powers of the universe to heal, to emerge, to evolution, one of the powers of the universe is cataclysm. And we are really in free-falling cataclysm in every system, education systems. Here are professors. I got a letter from one saying, I'm in trauma. The way I've taught my whole life with a live classroom full of students in front of me is gone now. I'm trying to learn how to do this online. Economic system, healthcare system, all of it. So what do? We look around us and start with our local community. But then when we hear of national things like these 900 kids at the border who come over seeking asylum alone and are summarily turned back without their parents even knowing it, what are we going to do about that? Who do we write to? Where do we in some kind of way take action that we will not be silent while that is happening to those children separated from their parents at the border? And then we begin to dig into it and look who's doing something, who's raising their voice, who's organizing action, and we become a part of that.
Okay, looks like we have one last question, unless any more come in. What is your understanding of prison reform in terms of restorative justice versus our present retributive justice? I'm thinking about compassionate circles that are happening in some prisons.
Yeah, good for you. Who's that asking that question?
Doesn't have a name.
Okay, no name. Great question. It's the only road, the road we have to take now. For years and years and years, we have thrown people away and punished them for their crimes. We have identified people with their crime and we have punished them. And that's what the penal system has been, punishment. Long, long sentences. And now you can just see the bubbles rising. You can see the consciousness being raised. Now we're beginning to have alternative drug courts. Why put young people in prison for most of their life because they got a drug problem? Wouldn't it be better to treat the drug problem? All these are ways in which now we're beginning to turn from just imprisonment and locking people up and throwing them away to alternative things of life, restorative justice. We got a long way to go, but you can just hear the consciousness as it's being changed. We never have had a presidential candidate before who said they were against the death penalty. Barack Obama wasn't. I was ready to go to bed. I said, if I had 5 minutes with President Obama, here he is, a black man saying this, saying that, well, people who do these terrible crimes, it's what I call the designer death penalty. People do these really terrible crimes that just so outrageous the community that the only justified punishment is death. What's he doing saying that? For the first time, why do we have now presidential candidates saying we can't have the death penalty? Why has the language changed from being tough on crime to being smart about crime? That people are wising up. Look at the huge cost to put people in prison for the rest of their life. Now you have a geriatric community. What's the sense in doing that? Why not take those good tax dollars and put them where they count with at-risk kids and an education, keep people from going to prison? So you can feel the consciousness rising on these things. And the word in the land is restorative justice. Some places beginning to practice it. Someone's been hurt in the community. Instead of the state taking over and throwing the criminal into the prison, you have circles that form. This is Native American wisdom. Who's been hurt? Who's the offender? Let's bring people together. What can be done to heal the community?
Okay. Oh, that question was from Sarah Zale, co-author of Strange Fruit, Poems on the Death Penalty.
Oh, Sarah, thank you. Good.
So we have, let's see, another question from Daryl. If you abolish the death penalty, is there a model or best practice that replaces it that offers reconciliation for community, victim, and the person who offended?
We have everywhere to go in terms of reconciliation with victims. You know, the criminal way the criminal justice system is set up, the state, when there's a crime, the state takes over. And victims are really out of the loop. In civil law, where a person's hurt, the victim is the one that can get restitution. And we have to do this holistic thing of restorative justice where both victim and offender, where we can have a healing in the community. And more to look at community questions when there's violence in a neighborhood, not to keep blaming it on an individual, but to look at the soil, look at the seeds that causes that violence. So look, thank you for your questions.
Okay, looks like, okay, we have 2 more questions here, and then we will wrap it up. So John Kerry was against the death penalty. Michael Dukakis famously fumbled a debate question in 1988 opposing a death. That's a comment more than a question here.
Yeah, those are true.
Yeah. And then the next question, what is your advice to young people who are seeking spiritual lives in the midst of our increasing secular culture? That's from Lynn.
Spirituality, when you look at it, it's in creation. It's in the trees that look so dead in winter and you see green leaves coming. Spirituality is not this separate thing that's only a religion thing in churches. And the young people I meet across this country are deeply spiritual. Look at young people's concern for climate change. That's a spiritual issue. And the connection of people with people, treating people with compassion, all these are spiritual issues. Again, to the young people, you got to feed your spiritual life. You got to read good books. You got to be in the company of people who are also searchers and people seeking a deep spiritual life so that you can cultivate that life like a garden. You can't just be out there on your own, just saying, oh, I'm going to be a deeply spiritual person. It's always going to be connected in community with other people. And man, they got great books of people sharing what a true deep spiritual life is. And this kind of unitive consciousness that doesn't divide things in dualistic ways, us and them. There's just a lot of good stuff out there. Anyway.
Okay, thank you. Great questions, everyone. And thank you, Sister Helen. You're truly one of my favorite people. Thank you for letting me be a part of this tonight. And thank you to Town Hall. I will turn it over to Town Hall.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. Sister Helen, thank you so much for your insight on this topic. And thank you for kind of piquing my curiosity of some Catholic Church history I'm not super familiar with, so I'm going to look into some of that. And thank you all for watching. If you are interested in more Town Hall content, you can click the follow button at the top right of your screen. And please, if you are interested in buying either of Sister Helen's books, buy them through Elliott Bay tonight to support them and the hopefully lasting store that they have. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jackie, for moderating. And thank you, Sister Helen, for your presentation. Everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Good night. Bye, Sister Helen.
Bye, Jackie.